Okay, so it didn't record, so I'm going to do just a brief overview of everything we talked about, starting with our microclimates or microhabitats. So these are smaller variations of conditions which vary across a landscape in smaller scales. So it can be as small as, 1 inch away from something else. There's a different thing there in its way. And we talked about the sunlight and how it's going to create differences in the north and the south and the east and the west in the northern hemisphere. The south is going to get more sun than the north, and the east is going to get more sun than the west is going to be hotter than the east. They'll both get the same amount of sun. So that means you're going to have more plant matter on more trees on the north because it'll be cooler and it'll hold more moisture. The south will be drier. So trees and rocks and other things will also, these are rocks, create different microclimates where there's variations in wind. Wind might be higher at the top than at the bottom as it's more exposed. You may also have differences in water availability. So we call areas next to the water riparian habitats. You'll have differences in soil and moisture, all those things along the streams and rivers. And so a mountain elevation provides heterogeneity, and heterogeneous habitats are therefore have a lot more variation, and so then they have more diversity, more biodiversity. All right, so that's the basics about microclimates. We talked about allocation, and I had this analogy of like creating a character, and the more you allocate towards one part of your of an animal's anatomy and physiology, the less will be available for other. And so the way that plays out is if ideally this population does really well in temperatures between 20 and 30 degrees, away from that, because all its resources are allocated to survival in this range, you go away from there, and you can't allocate resources in other temperatures as well, that each range is creating specific optimization for that organism. And so that's the basics of allocation. You can see that when we look down in these figures here, that the desert, when you look at the desert shrub and the boreal moss, you try and put the desert shrub into the boreal moss temperature range, and it just doesn't do it well. It can't be allocating resources towards this and this at the same time. Same thing, the boreal moss, you put it in temperatures of the desert shrub, even on the lower ends, and it just doesn't do well. So the environment shapes then the allocation of the resources of the species that are there. This second graph is a little bit less intuitive, but you can see essentially you have an organism which has a fitness, meaning survival and reproduction, at 40 degrees Celsius and another one at 20 degrees Celsius, two different ones. If it is, I think these are two different populations of the same species. So if it is fit at 20 degrees Celsius, so if it's high on this line, you can see that it is getting lower on this line. It is decreasing at 40 degrees as it's increasing at 20 degrees. So the more allocated it is or optimized towards 20, the less it's going to be at 40. All right, so let's see. And then we talked about the different thermal regulations, abilities to uh, regulate body temperature. Ectotherm relies on external or environmental inputs for thermal regulation. Endotherm is metabolic or internal uh, regulation of body temperature. Homeotherm means it's a narrow range of temperatures. And heterotherm means it can tolerate a wide range of temperatures. Poikilotherm is the weird one. That means that it cannot thermoregulate. It is matched to its environment. And so this is going to be organisms where they have a very stable temperature environment, such as burrowing organisms, where underground the temperature remains the same, or in the cave, or in the deep sea. All right, when we look at the total metabolic, not metabolic, but thermoregulation activity of a species, it is a function of these things in this equation. The sunlight does three of these. It can radiate heat. Sunlight and fire can radiate heat as well. So it's direct particles warming up an organism. Convection is the wind. The air is heated up, and as that passes over an organism, it can absorb or release heat. And conduction, that is touching something. So here we have this rock. It was heated up by the sun, and then it can transfer heat to or from the organism if it's cold or warm. The other two, this is metabolic heat. And metabolic heat is due to the internal chemical reactions occurring as you digest food or burn fat or whatever. And the last one, this is always negative. This is heat loss due to evaporation. Evaporation will never gain heat. So if there's water on an individual, as it evaporates, it takes off heat. Snakes don't sweat, so it might do this as it gets in the water and then gets out of the water, but other animals can sweat. So all these things then make up the heat equation of individual species. All right, the last thing we did is we talked about Allen's rule and Bergman's rule. Allen's rule is appendages. As polar species will have smaller appendages, smaller legs and ears, and more equatorial species will have larger appendages, and this is to radiate heat away from the body, and then for polar species to conserve heat. Bergman's rule is body size, so this is within a species. You will find that individuals that are polar are larger in body size than equatorial. And this has to do with essentially thermal inertia. The larger you are, the more heat you can hold, and the less heat you will lose when it is cold out. The smaller you are, the easier it is to get rid of heat. And how would you test these hypotheses? Well, you could look at deer species that have a very north to south population size, but that really wouldn't be testing. It would add evidence that might add to it, but it would just be correlative in data. So if we found in Maine deer were larger than deer in Florida, that would say, oh, well, this provides evidence towards Bergman's rule, but you can't really say it is that until you experimentally show, all right, when I hold deer in this cold environment, it will evolve, it will select towards a larger size. That would take millions of years. Maybe not millions, but tens, maybe thousands. Okay, so that's that. And we didn't get to these other two things.